Good day, good evening, good morning, depending on where you are on this planet, this pandemic planet, this warming planet, this very human planet. Whether you agree that we're in a geological age called the Anthropocene, we are definitely a global force, for better or worse. And that's not just for the biogeophysical non-human part of the planet, but for societies all around the world. The coronavirus is proving to us how connected we are, whether we want to be or not. Paths forward are going to be variegated. Not every country can do the same thing on climate or on pandemic risk, but we have to figure out ways to connect with each other and to attack these problems in a sustained way. It's a very tough challenge, and there's a generation that's come of age right in the middle of it. I'm really pleased to be able to have this episode of sort of a special pop-up episode of Sustain What, my webcast. It's 2 months old today, I think. Is today the 15th? Yeah, I started this on a Sunday in mid-March when the noise level out there seemed pretty high, and the idea was to foster some constructive conversations on how to make information matter. That's my initiative at Columbia University, which is brand new in the middle of all this, is aimed to smooth the waters a little bit, find out how to get constructive pathways amid disagreement and complexity and uncertainty. And today, this is the University of California system, has an online course, which is really cool to know that the system of schools has unified approaches to online learning on water and sanitation justice. And I think it was Abigail who reached out to me first to say they wanted me to answer some questions. I said, well, let's do it publicly. So let's do it for like the whole world. And they're playing along with that idea. Abigail and maybe Kristen, can you introduce yourselves and then introduce the course and just describe it a little bit, and then we can get to some of the questions and the like.
Yeah, I'm Abigail Brown, and I'm one of the co-creators of the course, along with Kirsten Rudisam here today and a team of 3 other faculty. And I think I'll let Kirsten just give a brief overview of our course, and I can talk a little bit about what we're working on with climate justice, if it's okay with you, Andrew.
Yeah.
Okay.
So Kristen?
Yeah,
Kristen?
just unmuting myself. Yeah, so
okay.
like Abby said, we developed this course in 2016, and our goal was really to have a class that analyzes multiple theories of justice that apply to water and sanitation. And we were wanting to pull from both practical and academic sources and theories to analyze water and sanitation injustice. And each week focuses on a different theme. So we've talked about water governance and human rights and sanitation justice, and this week we're covering climate justice. So we're just so delighted to have you. Thank you.
I'm delighted to be here.
Yes, we're really delighted to have you. So this week we're doing climate justice, and what the students have kind of been moving through, they've been looking at political interventions to address climate change and issues of justice within them. They've been looking at market approaches like cap and trade and issues of justice within that. And now for the portion with you and what we hope to gain from all your many years of writing about climate change and climate activism is understanding how climate activism, both on the organizational scale, on the individual scale, bottom-up approaches have impacted climate justice and the climate divide. And so we gave them the 2 articles that you sent along, the forefronts and the once derided article about adaptive approaches. And so they have created many questions to ask you, mostly on climate justice, but also about climate activism and some other things. So that being said, I think Kirsten and I are going to exit the StreamYard chat so we can make room for 2 more students. We have 8 students shifting through here, so we want to make sure that there's plenty of space for them to talk.
That's pretty great, and everyone can watch, on the other platforms. The green room has a limited room too. It's kind of like a small space. There are some M&Ms and there's a beer there, I think, but it's a small space. So yeah, good. All right, if you want to step back, that's fine, and we'll get this going. And let's see, here's, so we'll do a little round robin here as people come in and just say who you are, where you are. I'm really interested about this course being distributed, and of course you're home from school, regardless of where your school is. So maybe we'll start with Rebecca and just fill us in.
Cool. Hi, my name's Rebecca. I'm originally from Anaheim, California, but I'm still up here in Santa Cruz doing the Zoom lectures. Sociology major, and I'm graduating in a couple weeks. But I'm pretty stoked to be here also.
That's great, and congratulations to those who are graduating. It's such a, I have a son who just graduated from BU in December. He thought he was getting out the door early. He was very excited.
Aww.
Kaboom, but everyone's hitting a wall right now. It's such a
strange time.
Hard moment.
Yeah.
Well, we'll try to help you as much as we all can, the older folks. So yeah, and then just go around and then we can start with the questions. And Min, where are you and what's your background?
Hi, my name is Min Nguyen. I live in San Jose and I'm currently back in San Jose. I am a community studies major, and anything else would you like to know?
So what year are you, or how far along are you?
I am a third year and I transferred into UC Santa Cruz.
Okay, what beautiful there in the Redwoods.
Yeah.
And Caden.
Hey, my name's Caden. I currently live in Santa Cruz, California. I'm studying sociology there, and I'm about to graduate as well. But right now, I am out in Springfield, Virginia, waiting out this pandemic.
Is that a rural area? I don't know the name Springfield.
It's right outside of DC, so it's...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We'll talk more about the specific issues in some of these places. And Tiana.
Hi, I'm Tiana. I also go to Santa Cruz, but I've been back in Oakland since about spring break. I'm a sociology and legal studies double major, and I'm just finishing up my second year. So,
okay, so that's great to hear the range of your tracks too. Cecilia.
Hi. I am actually a UCR student, but I'm taking the class through the cross-campus enrollment, and I'm a sociology major. Thanks for having us.
Sure.
I'm a bit nervous to present a live anything, so I'm really hoping I don't mess up.
No, it's no, believe me, I started this 2 months ago with no practice. I just popped online and said, hey, let's try to figure out where we're at and where we go from here. So it's okay. Everyone's allowed to be imperfect. So let's start with it. So just come at me with your questions. Maybe, I don't know if you already had an order in mind, but otherwise it would be the same order you just were introduced in. But just let's fire away.
Okay. I think there is an order if you guys want to follow that, or if you just want to go in the...
Just go with among the ones who are
circle.
online. Just go in the order that you already have.
I think that would be me
Abigail,
first.
Kristen, yeah, just go for it.
Okay. My question is focusing on climate justice, not necessarily like the climate activism side. To solutions like climate change, such as electric cars and efficient light bulbs, are predicated on economic resources that are unavailable to many low-wealth communities of color. What climate change strategies would you implement to ensure that people of all income levels can take part in and benefit from living sustainability?
It's a really interesting, this is such an important question. And the thing that I start with, I first wrote about this divide, the climate divide in 2007 in a big way in the Times. And it was a global story. So I convinced reporters in everywhere from Australia to India to Malawi to the Netherlands to show the world the difference between if you're rich and poor, what the impacts of climate are on your lives. And, there's definitely impacts, well, in California with wildfire, if you build in the wrong place, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. But overall, it's a huge factor. And by the way, on social media, I've been using the hashtag COVID-19 divide and the hashtag climate divide because it's a very similar issue. With COVID, the people in the front lines who are being affected most in a health context tend to be of color low income. They're the ones who are forced, their jobs require them to be in harm's way. And the economic impacts are most on them too. So hopefully this moment will reinforce for all of us that there's merit in the public sphere to support, whether it's climate risk or health risk, there's a common benefit to having that be something that we all contribute to solving. Specifically on climate and energy, it gets a little complicated because there's also energy justice and there's an energy divide. You know, energy is a big chunk of a poor person's budget. There are people on Indian reservations in the United States who still cook on coal, like actual lumps of coal, in a fire, like a wood stove, because they can get it somewhere nearby. They work in the Southwest in a coal area, and they're affected by all the indoor pollution from energy. In poor places like India, a woman spends 3 or 4 hours a day just collecting the firewood and dung to cook the meals and clean the pots that are sooty, and she's exposed to high levels of pollution. So, and some in India, for example, they've had a program in place to offer propane, the gas that we have under our gas grills. You know, it's a clean fuel. It's an on-off switch. It's super efficient. It's actually very low emission compared to burning biomass in your house. So that would be something you would say, oh my God, well, we all want to get off fossil fuels, therefore we can't have any propane. But in that case, the full dimensions of the justice question would include thinking about propane for poor people. So it's complicated, you know, but I think the basics are that societies all over the world need to think clearly about what are the fundamental needs of every person in our country and our community, whether it's for energy, whether it's for climate resilience, and what are the factors we're doing right now that are worsening that vulnerability that we know how to work on today. And then in the long run, it's like, you know, can you have a way to work, whether you're commuting in a Tesla or doing your work at home? What can you do there to even the playing field so that everyone has that option of getting to work affordably, of getting home, of doing the work at home? Actually, just a few weeks ago in this show, we had a guy who's his activism is for internet access, full internet access as a basic right. Rich, poor, you should have the ability for your kids, especially now, learning at home. You know, there's tens of millions of kids in America who don't have access to the internet or have just limited access, or they're fighting with their parent for the iPhone to over lessons versus getting a job. That's actually a resilient strategy that even benefits the climate in the long run. So that's the key. I think finding ways for communities to recognize and truly value, to build that value of energy access and climate and other resilience into their societies at large is a key. Great question. So who's next?
Thank you.
All right, so I'm next. You sort of answered my question a little bit, but I pulled ideas from your article reports from 4 fronts in the war on warming. I kind of wrote that wrong, I think. But let me see. So I can't help but keep bringing up COVID-19 and the disparities among different communities and basic rights and such, as you were talking about. So my question is, do you notice parallels between climate justice and COVID-19 in a sense where the rich are equipped to deal with the consequences while the poor adapt? How are activists speaking out about linkages between climate justice and COVID-19?
There's been a lot. I've seen one thing that I think probably is not as productive as people hope, which is activism that's looking at the landscape and the chaos right now and saying climate matters too. Don't forget climate change. I think that's minimally useful. What I think is useful is when activists who've built their networks and their impact around climate challenges or energy challenges or, you know, renewable future or the Green New Deal or 350.org movement built over the last 15 years. It's effectively linking people around the world. It's to pause and think, what can I do with my network and my network skills that can apply to this current crisis? And that's a way to potentially broaden both your visibility and trust in the wider community. So, you know, we're not just about climate. We're about humanity and basic rights and principles. And I worry sometimes that making things too climate centric can take away the opportunity to widen the net. And I'll give you a quick example from the New York area. When Hurricane Sandy hit, there was this very effective downtown protest movement called Occupy Wall Street. And they were in the streets. It was all about Wall Street and, you know, power and money. And then they became Occupy Sandy. And they applied their skills to the real-time emergency of getting food to people in isolated buildings, or, you know, where the power wasn't on and elevators weren't working and elderly people are on high floors of buildings. So by shifting their own perspective toward the problem at hand, they were able to, I think, create a more valuable sense of what they're about, as opposed to saying, hey, all you worrying about COVID-19, you still got to decarbonize. There's a time for everything and a place for everything. Another example, just a month ago on this show, I call it a show, I guess it is a show. I connected with people in Bhopal, India, 4 or 5 middle-class individuals who had formed a food distribution network. Because when India went into lockdown, lots of poor people couldn't get even 100 rupees a day, couldn't get to fresh water to wash their hands, couldn't have basic sustenance, were going hungry. And so they formed like a food hub. And it was WhatsApp connected, so people in slums could get them the food. And you know what they had started initially? They were a plastic reduction campaign, who turned their attention to building a food network. But their main issue in Bhopal in India was to reduce plastic waste. So I love that idea of adaptability, you know, and then you get trust and the wider sense of community cohesion. Great question.
Thank you.
Who's next? And there are a couple of people in the waiting room, in the green room. So at some point you'll have to click off. Whoever, you know, is done here, if you click out, then I can get them on camera too. So, but let's go to the next question.
Hey, my question for you is, market-based solutions like cap and trade seem to have more of a local benefit, while communities around industries that are able to put out more emissions are still at risk and disproportionately affected. So do you think that market-based solutions are still valuable and able to be effective in reaching climate justice, or is there more justice happening in climate activist spheres?
It's, you know, there's so many parts of the climate question where the either or question never ends up being the answer is never either or, it's and. I do think the history shows us examples where market forces have been able to reduce pollution. Sometimes history shows that just simply identifying the pollution reduces pollution. That there was this, just Google for TRI, toxics release inventory, where they just required companies to start measuring stuff, and they just said, wow, why are we wasting that stuff? But on the market forces, the experiments in carbon pricing so far around the world have had limits. It's kind of when the market limit for tolerance of the higher price fuel or whatever gets to a certain point, like in France with the yellow vest protests, when the gasoline price for car to fill up your car or truck tank got too high. It's a feedback mechanism that says that's too high. And that seems to always be that ceiling seems to be way too low to have a climate benefit. And that means that the political pressure for cheap energy at least not to make it more expensive, dominates. And that means, that leads me, has led me over the years to think more and more about innovation, things that cut the cost of the alternative, whether it's solar, renewable solar and batteries, so that it's not just a Tesla owner who can benefit. So that's like market forces can work, but you also need to pulse the innovation front and then you have to think about innovation at the far end of the scale. It's social innovation too. How do you have communities where the poor households can have that benefit that they might not even have the capacity to apply for, to know it exists? So that's that expansive view that has to be there too. So it's kind of and. I talked to Bill Gates about an innovation in 2016 And he was all about, the next generation nuclear power plant and big innovation. And he didn't seem to be thinking like at the village scale, what's necessary to get at least adequate energy to cook meals and the like. That's innovation too. There's so much more to say on each of these questions, but I'll try to keep it short. We can follow up on these things too afterwards. So good one. And who's next?
Hi, I think that's me.
And actually, before you go, maybe I'll click off. Let's see, if Rebecca and Min can go into the green room, then I can bring on Ariana and Quanchu. And hold on one second, and you can ask your question. I just want to kind of get this organized here.
Oh yeah, for sure.
There's Ariana and Rebecca. I'm gonna minimize you. Quanchu, oh, her device is not connected. Maybe she can. Oh, she's coming. Oh, she's trying. Let's see. Well, if someone can text, is it Qian Shu Zhang? I'm gonna kick her out. But if someone can tell her to try to come back in, that'd be great. So hold on, I'm just gonna kick from studio. All right, sorry about the technical distraction there. Okay, so who was next? I'm sorry.
Hi,
Tiana?
I think that was me. Yeah. So my question was basically kind of about how climate change disproportionately affects citizens of like poor and developing countries, kind of despite the fact that wealthy global superpowers like the US are the ones that have like historically contributed the most to greenhouse gas emissions. I feel like this issue really reflects how poor and like POC communities in America are also unduly burdened by air pollution and other like climate issues. Do you think formulating, like from a policy standpoint, formulating solutions kind of on a global scale and trailing down to individual states would be more effective, or kind of going the other way around, like starting with local and state policy and then expanding internationally?
The beginning, I didn't catch the beginning. Could you just repeat it again? I just want the audio was not quite perfect. I got the basic idea, but I just want to be sure. Just say it again.
Oh, the question?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Do you think formulating kind of policies and solutions on a global scale first, and then moving down to more localized policy and for individual states would be more effective, or just starting the other way around? Kind of like
that's I think the learning that led to the Paris Agreement, the 2015 addendum to the big treaty. The learning there was that you can't have the top-down solution. You can have a top-down framework, meaning we agree to meet every 5 years. We agree to review what countries are doing. But what happened in the global scale was that, and I've been writing about this since the 1980s. The first goal in the 80s was let's have a treaty, like a contract, like I'm going to buy your house, and here are the rules, and here's the punishment if you fail to pay your bills, blah, blah, blah. And that it took until 2009. So from 1992 until 2009 for the world to realize, oh, you know what? There's 200 countries in the world. They have such different geographies and histories and contexts. You can't get them all to abide by one path on decarbonization or on energy access and resilience. And so Paris Agreement was plastic. It said, okay, we're not going to force you to do anything. And it's a big fail in some ways because it says, we can't set a perfect limit, but it's a perfect path, a perfect design for plasticity, for having countries come to the table. This is what we're doing. These are our challenges. Here's some ideas you might be able to use in your country. That it forces that conversation, but it doesn't force the outcomes. Nationally, we're having the same debate with coronavirus right now. Is what's the role of the top-down federal standard? What's the role of the states? And mayors, are becoming a significant force in dealing with corona. And that's where, when you start to realize that at the local level, that's where you really understand the dynamics of a community, both politically, socioeconomically, and where you have the best chance of having a policy that can change things for the better. Some of that depends on political inclusion, right? If the marginal communities don't have a voice, then that whole mayoral or state or local landscape won't take them into account. So that's, first you have to have full inclusion, full participation. And then you can hash out whether it's coronavirus or energy access, or like a program on weatherization, for homes, or access to low interest loans to get solar panels in a community. That's got to be there too. You do need federal things like energy standards for air conditioners, but it'll never be a federal or a top-down. Even with climate, the idea of the CO2 regulation, you've seen how hard it is for that to catch on as the driver of change. I think we'll have regulation eventually when this country shifts a little bit in its politics, but it's not going to be the determiner of outcomes. That really does happen at the local level. And I'm going to say goodbye to Kaden and bring in, let's see, who's here. Hi.
Hi.
How do you pronounce your name?
千雪.
千雪.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome. And I'm trying to get everyone who's new. You should just say briefly, like, where you are geographically and what are you studying? And by the way, there's some really good questions that are coming in from your classmates on in the comment stream that we're going to have to spend a few minutes on too. So for the newcomers here, just say who you are and where you're at.
I could start. My name's Ariana. I'm a fourth year at UC Santa Cruz, so I'll be graduating this quarter. I'm originally from Salinas, California, which is about 38 miles south of Santa Cruz. It's not too far from Santa Cruz area. And I am majoring in environmental studies.
Are things in that area? You're down there now, or where are you now? Right?
And Salinas.
What's the situation there right now? I know that food production has been, that's a big food producing area.
Yeah.
And it's a very disrupted part of our landscape. Just a quick question.
Yeah, it's a lot due to current situations. Agriculture, as you said, it's a strong industry here. But as I've seen, they're still trying to produce as much as they can, but a lot of it is more so going not the best efficient use of it, just because not a lot of people are buying produce as much as, or the restaurants are closing, so there's not all that extra produce going to restaurants overall.
It's such a weird, and that leads to all these weird issues with like too much stuff and not enough stuff at the same time.
Yeah.
Wild. Okay, so who's next in line for question? Oh, sorry, and then Quenchu, where are you living right now, and what program are you in?
Oh yeah, my name is 千雪 Zhang. Actually, in Chinese, like we call 张千雪. And right now I'm located in San Jose, and actually I come from China, and yeah, and I am majoring in psychology.
We need more psychology majors focused on issues like climate. It's a big chunk of the problem. Okay, so let's go with the questions. Who was next in line? I think, yeah. You might be muted.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was trying to load my questions we wrote them all out on the Google Docs, but mine's not loading.
Oh, that's okay. I don't have that open right now, so just fire away, or just the general idea.
So like, I don't want to name names or anything, but in our political world, there are certain leaders who believe that climate change is a hoax and global warming is a hoax. These people that believe that the climate fluctuates, as you mentioned in your article, it fluctuates over thousands of years, highs and lows. So I feel like this is generally the backbone of many arguments when people are saying like it's a hoax, like weather changes, whatever. So this debate comes up a lot in my family, particularly because my dad thinks it's a hoax. So I have to explain to him, we do have an impact on climate. So I just wanted to ask you, how would you argue like against hoax believers and
Well,
that sort
this is a great question, and it comes up a lot. What I've learned is that it's actually sometimes it's better not even the argument idea doesn't really work. There's this phenomenon called cultural cognition. I'll actually put that in the. Whoops! Hold on a second. Let's type this here. Cultural cognition.net. There's a guy at Yale who studies why people hold beliefs, and it's actually rational to be irrational sometimes. And you can see that right now with opinions on what to do about the virus as well. And that comes from deep-rooted parts of the human being, meaning your tribe is more valuable to you, even evolutionarily. Like, as a survival strategy, it's better to be part of a tribe than to be an outlier, an outcast. You just think of the idea of the outcast. So your political affiliations tend to dominate your sense of data, that you look at data the different ways. That feels very discouraging. When I started writing about that stuff in 2006, it was kind of, oh my God, you mean information doesn't matter? And as a journalist, that's kind of what I do, right? I tell the world stuff that I've seen and reported on that I think is important. And that was a bummer. But then the same work also shows you, and I bet you could have a discussion with your dad about the future of our energy system. Like, would you rather have it be polluting or not polluting? Would you rather have it be sustainable source or not? And then you can find lots more areas that you agree on. You could say, should our community be vulnerable to wildfire? Why do our building codes allow people to build stupid, flammable buildings in the middle of a forest? That's something I'm sure he'll agree on. I bet you, like those two questions. So no one wants to be vulnerable to the climate. No one I know wants to think of the future energy supply as the same as the current energy supply. Smog is still, you've seen clean skies lately. And then you step back and you realize you didn't even have to argue about climate change. Because what are the things you want in climate policy?
Yeah.
You want to move away from dirty energy, and you want to be not as vulnerable to climate risk. So you've sort of solved the climate debate without even talking about climate. And there's lots of stories I've written about that. Even in Oklahoma, even in the very skeptical part of Oklahoma, a reporter found a guy who's like getting off the grid using solar panels in his house. He also doesn't believe in evolution. He would never vote for Hillary Clinton. And you could fight those fights, for the rest of your life. Why don't you believe in evolution? That's not going to get the guy to change, but he's getting off the grid because he doesn't like to be dependent on a utility. It's the same reason he would never vote for a Democrat, probably. But it means you can talk about clean energy with that person. So I guess the key there is just think carefully about what you want in the world of climate and energy, and go find a way to talk in a different, whichever context is right for the audience, about those things, and not worry so much about that big thing, global warming, which I've been writing about, which I've been doing this, this is like 1988, right? So global warming, I could just keep writing that same story, but that's not going to get your father's attention. So that's what I recommend.
You would think you're conspiracy. But thank you so much.
Sure, thank you.
And I'll so you can answer more students' questions.
I see Rebecca. Yeah, thank you. And Rebecca's going to come in. I see her. And Caden, if you could switch to watching on like YouTube or Periscope now, that'd be great. Just so there's room in the
I already asked my question. I can go.
Oh, you did.
As well.
Well, let's keep you on until there's room now. There's room for 8 people in that back in the green room. So if more come on, you would be the first to go off. Good to see you again. So before we go to, well, actually, pronounce your name again. I'm sorry.
千雪.
千雪. But
Yeah.
you ask your question now, and then I'll go to some of the ones that have come in on the comment string.
Okay. I have a question for you. Is like I have been reading your report from 4 fronts in the war on warming, and it do like give me a sense like some countries are contribute less to climate change are bearing a greater proportion of the risk from the climate change, which like seems to me is obviously like a distributive injustice. So and the poor country, the more difficult for them to resist the negative effect of the climate change. So like I want to ask, like, do you agree with that? Like those first world countries who contribute more to the climate change should to be responsible for those third world countries, like the difficulty they are facing now. And if so, like in what way you think they should to pay their climate debt?
No, this is a great one. And actually, I showed you this magazine a minute ago. Back in 1988, there was a section in here that got at this. So this is like, 30 something years ago, that got at that exact point where I said, and this was about China at the time. It said, it's why should the rich countries of the world expect developing countries to get off of coal, for example, quickly, when we've already used coal for 100 years to get prosperous? And that is an obligation. If you care about climate, you can't ask countries that are just getting out of poverty now. China is now different. It's more developed. But Indonesia is still on the way up. India is still, there's more than 300 million people in India. So that's like the entire population of the United States who don't have access to reliable electricity. And for us to say, oh, you guys just have to stay in the dark is completely unethical. So a climate policy has to integrate some kind of a handoff there. And in a way, it's similar to in public health, when you think about how we all need to value full access to health, because that helps all of society. If we have a system that excludes big chunks of the world population or big chunks of the United States population, will always be vulnerable to pandemics, because that basic access is a fundamental way the world needs to function. So the challenge is always that energy access, as I said earlier, matters too. So you can't just say to India, you need stronger action to get off of coal. You have to say, what can we do to facilitate you building a more efficient plant? If you're going to have a coal-fired power plant, can we help you make it cleaner? Can we give away some of our technology, perhaps? And those are tough technical issues related to trade and the like, but they have to be part of a climate plan. It's a great question.
Thank you.
So now I'm going to go to some of the questions that came in the very long and rich comment string. So let's see what we got here. I got to make them bigger so my aging eyes can read them. Hold on. Here we go. I'm going to start with the ones from your classmates. I might have showed some of these earlier. Here's Nalia Duenas says, many people discuss that using technology to cool the planet may be the only way to deal with the greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. This is the idea of geoengineering, or managing the climate actively. Right now we're pushing on it involuntarily, accidentally releasing all these CO2 molecules. Can we put something up there or do something giant to slow the warming? I wrote a lot about that on my blog, and it's an interesting arena. There's two big components of it. One is actually cooling the planet by putting particles in the air that block sunlight. And you can do that right now. That's actually easy. It's pretty low tech. Volcanoes do it every year. In 1815, there was the year without summer, when the Tambora volcano in Indonesia exploded and cooled the planet, disrupted weather patterns around the world. So we know that that's doable. We know it happens naturally. The challenge there is, there are many questions. To do it intentionally is hard, because you're working on a system that's complicated, and you can't predict all the outcomes if we put dust in the atmosphere way up high. And some countries might be harmed by that. Others might benefit from that. It means that agriculture would have less sunlight. So you might be cooling the planet, but also reducing agriculture. So it's a tough one. The other one is taking CO2 out of the air. That's capturing carbon and storing it away somewhere for the long haul. We can do that to a certain extent with trees. There's a trillion tree project that's been proposed. It's pretty complicated because trees do more than one thing to the climate. You can do it with technology. You can do it. Some of the technology is essentially accelerating geology. You're taking catalysts that can take CO2 out of the stream of air and put it away. Costs money. It has to be done at a giant scale. We're producing 40 billion tons of CO2 a year. And the biggest projects on the planet so far have been 1 million tons a year, putting it down into an old oil well. So that's like, think about the number of zeros, the difference between 1 million and 40 billion. It's a big challenge, but it has to be part of the picture going forward. There's no way to go towards zero to have a stable climate system without some kind of technology. It's not going to be easy, but none of this is easy. So let's see what else we have here. And by the way, when I read these, if any of you have some thoughts about you want to add, you can do that too. So she also says, oh, that's the same. Hold on. Sandy Chung, do you think the system of cap and trade, we kind of talked about cap and trade, that it's unfair as richer companies in cooperation will have more access to more emissions quantity. Yeah, cap and trade systems have many complexities that have to be dealt with, as I said earlier, and there's no demonstrated example on the planet yet that has taken emissions down at a rate that the climate system will really notice. So I think there's merits to keeping that in the mix. The fairness issue is there also because if you're raising the price of energy, that tends to affect poor and working class people more than the rich. And energy is a tiny part of a rich person's budget. It's a big part of a poor person's budget. Good question. Oh, and also that's the tail end of that same question. Hold on, there's another one. LB, you guys know who LB is? Oftentimes, rural areas of Mexico burn their trash as a form of sanitation. What are your thoughts on this? And is it possible to find solutions that don't require the burning of plastic? Yeah, there are actually places in the world where people are, there's some informal settlements in Africa where among the fuels used to cook on are plastic. So in a stove, you're burning plastic to cook on. The pollution levels are terrible and toxic. There are, for sanitation at the large scale in the world, there are countries that are very green that do burn trash partially still as a way to generate energy. In Scandinavia, this is still common. In the United States, it's basically ended. Actually, in many places because of the justice issue, because you never see one of these waste to energy plants in a rich person's neighborhood. You tend to see them in a poor person's neighborhood. And with your focus on sanitation, same thing. Where are the sewage treatment plants? The one in Manhattan is in Harlem, and the emissions from it are not affecting the rich parts of the city. The waste, when they wanted to have a barging system for garbage, it was not on the east side of Manhattan where the millionaires live. So the justice issues are all around on this kind of question. There can be a role for technology at the local scale, but I'd have to dig in more on that answer. Great question. These are all really good. Who else is here? Not sure if this is a student or not. Christina Vagnoni says, young people are going to bear the burden of climate change, but our voices are not heard in the government. What steps can we take in the coming years to protect our future on this planet? Well, get in the government. It's hard to say now. You know, people, the political environment is so toxic and so discouraging sometimes. But if we don't keep a pipeline of young people who are galvanized and willing to not only serve as elected officials, but to be, whether it's lobbyists or community organizers or get out the vote folks or lawyers working on relevant legislation. Like there's a big group at Columbia, the law school, there's the Sabin Center for Climate Law. All they do is climate legislation. And there's lots of young people working there who are doing fantastic work, helping to use laws to get at some of the justice issues. So it's like, I guess the key thing is to vote for sure. As you all know, your cohort in the world still has a pretty low voting proportion compared to older people. So that feels sometimes like a waste of time too, but it's never been more important. Great question. Dora Q says, what is something that you would tell climate change deniers? How can we approach someone with this kind of mindset? That's kind of like what I was just addressing with one of your colleagues a minute ago. I would say there's many ways to have a conversation, to engage with somebody, and starting by listening a lot. Always listen. Don't come in with your big placard first. Listen, get a sense of that person's background. And you can start to say, talk about the energy future. They might be pro-nuclear, and that's actually good. If you say we want a zero carbon energy system, that might be something you would disagree with, depending on your position on nuclear. But at least it shows that they're into clean energy. And then you can work your way forward in a conversation that way. And let's see, Dora had another part here. Now here's Alyssa Wong. How do we convince leaders in power of the urgency of the climate change crisis? Oh my God. Well, and here's the second part. Despite warnings from scientists and detrimental consequences taking place as a result of climate change, not enough action has been taken to mitigate the impact. Yeah, it's a hard one. Some leaders, President Obama was very much had climate in the foreground. President Trump has had it in the foreground in the opposite way. He's tuned his campaigns to a small proportion of Americans who have outsized influence because of where their states are in terms of who becomes president, who have latched on to that cultural badge of rejecting climate science, and that's their beacon. So that's a tough challenge. The leadership, though, can do the same thing we were just talking about when we talked about climate denial. And how do you have a conversation with somebody? Well, in the same thing, you could talk about clean energy with a big chunk of Congress. And you look at the maps of America, there's no red and blue. There are no red and blue states when it comes to attitudes on clean energy, on the value of renewable energy, even on regulating CO2. There's a great group at Yale that does this periodic survey that shows that you can have agreement on those things. And so that's in Congress, it requires sometimes, reimagining what a Green New Deal could be that will actually pass through the United States Congress system. It's a next step in the Green New Deal question. And the same thing is going on right now as, I love that dog. We've seen the same thing in Congress as, in the presidential race right now, Biden and Bernie Sanders and AOC and others are forming a task force on climate. And AOC and Biden don't agree on a lot when it comes to the severity, how you would go forward. There's a lot of overlap there, but that kind of it's not bipartisan, but I mean, that's a broad tent within the Democratic Party. You can start to get some progress. Good question from Alyssa. Acela Rangel says, what are some observations you have made of how communities are dealing with climate change? What communities are doing the most impact with the least resources? Oh, there's some great examples. And there are two fronts here, like every aspect of this. The two fronts are adapting. How do you make your community more resilient to climate hazards or to coastal flooding? And that is an area where you can see significant progress at the local level. I'm going to pull up a story that gets at this. Give me a second. So on resilience, I think for sure you can make a lot of progress on the ground by looking carefully at your zoning, at the way you build your buildings, at the way you make judgments about how to grow as a community. Having a long-term plan for a community can be a great way to step forward in things that will have big climate benefits, but that you don't get divided on. Here's the Shinnecock Indian tribe on Long Island has been a leader in figuring out ways to protect their coastal territory from climate impacts. And the Siobhan Smith there is someone I was going to do a panel with. It got canceled because of COVID-19. She does wonderful work looking at ways to adapt coastal landscapes to what's coming with rising sea levels. And I encourage people to look at that. There's other, just did a story for National Geographic, similarly explores ground up ways to build more resilience. This was Hurricane Michael, devastated that part of Florida, the Panhandle. And this article talks about the importance of the opportunity to build more resilience, even as we figure out the energy problem. Now, the energy challenge is a tougher part of this. Decarbonizing your local economy is only so much you can do, right? You still have to be on the grid. And so the grid, getting rid of the coal is the first step, as we're doing in this country, slowly. Finding ways to build more resilience in the grid so you can have more renewables is important. Communities in the New York State where I live can buy, as a community, you can say, we are a renewable community, and you can just buy solar and wind power from the grid. And that's one thing that's happening in the Hudson Valley. And I imagine California has got to be into that as well. Let's see who else we got here. Great.
I do still have to ask my question.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I was going too fast. Yeah. Thank you. Ariana, so what is your question, Ariana? I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's going back based on the reports from for fronts in the world of warming. I was just curious on the example that you provided on climate change effects on the farmers, that they eventually changed their crops near rivers due to the ongoing droughts near the area, if I understood that correctly. But however, it's considered an illegal act among Malawi to do so. And that kind of hurt another farmer, Jesse Kahn, if I pronounced that correctly, who relied on that water for the ponds that they made from the late 1990s. So based on that example, and as I understood earlier in the article, it was mentioning that the city of Malawi was trying to adapt to these climate change effects. So why, I just wanted to get some input. Why or weren't they enforcing those kinds of actions, even though they were illegal? Is that kind of considered towards the issue of like an ethical issue of whether are they using the water efficiently for farming purposes, or versus the societal need of the resource and the management of water overall?
I'd have to look back at the specifics in that area. That was reported by my friend Samini Sengupta. She was a contributor to that story. She's now a climate reporter at the New York Times. She was covering India at that time. Oh no, that was another reporter, Shannon Lafreniere, I think. These local circumstances can always get tangled, and that you'll always have trade-offs and competing interests. And that sounds like a classic case of a kind of a competing interest question. I'd have to look back at the specifics, but that you see that in every part of the climate problem, where, as I was saying earlier, this is a very different example, but if you raise the tax on fossil fuel and it causes truck drivers to lose their income, and you end up in France with big protests by truck drivers shutting down the highways. That's this feedback system, and it means that you have to think at the local level how you can be attuned to that notion. Like, and actually, water management historically has always come into this question. You know, if you have more than one dam on a river, like the Mekong or a river in California, if you're managing, actually the Colorado River system is the biggest example out west. You know, since the 20s, there's been these 1920s, there's been these big agreements on how to share the Colorado River. And they're running into trouble because the basic change in the climate is changing how much water there is in the river. I've drawn back from the specifics because I wouldn't be able to have the time right now to look at that specific example in Malawi. But I think that the key is to think of ways to understand these trade-offs and competing interests and figure out how to have the same thing. It requires having the whole community be in the conversation to resolve those kinds of disputes. I hope that
Thank you.
helps. I could
Yeah.
put you in touch with Somini Sengupta if we need to, if you want to dig in more.
Mhm.
It's a good question. So let's go back, and I'm sorry that I skipped you there. It was challenging
No worries.
getting through the everyone here. Oh yeah, I got your note too. Sorry about that. And good luck with everything else going forward. This is true for everyone. You know, those of you who are graduating and those of you who are still working in your universities where so much will happen online, like you're doing now. There's a lot of adaptability. That same adaptive capacity that we need on climate, we need now in how we learn and how we teach, because it's the same thing. We're all in a changing system. So let's see who else was here. Zara Yoveva asks, what are some things that can be done to reduce levels of greenhouse gas emissions? Is there anything that young people can do to make a difference? Or maybe, well, I guess I'll build, I can't remember if this is the same one from earlier, but you know, I mentioned about getting into politics, but you can also get into engineering, you can get into entrepreneurship. What I see, what I've observed about the climate problem is that it's so big that feels very daunting and paralytic. It's so complicated, right? So where do you start? But the opportunity there is that it means there's something for anyone to contribute on. If you're a teacher or an engineer, even an artist, there's some great artists working on climate communication. And certainly as an entrepreneur or an engineer, you can find a path, or a politician, that can address some aspect of this grand challenge. And it requires taking it into its pieces and not thinking about it so much as the climate crisis. Solve the climate crisis. That can drive you crazy. It's like solving the COVID crisis. It's the same thing. Find some aspect of it. Food supply, virology. There's something for everyone to do on COVID-19 and on pandemic risk in the same way. Let's see, we have a couple more minutes here. I'm going to try to get into a few more. How frustrating it is it trying to work with and or convince people? Oh, I asked that one earlier. Sarah Burrows, what would you tell someone who rejects the idea that their daily actions and privileges are connected to disparities in other communities? Well, that's, you know, that's a grand challenge that we all have in trying to build a community ethic. And again, that transcends climate. That's about what is the public good? And that's with how many hospital beds should we have access to? Does a private hospital system have enough flexibility? And does our current way of paying for healthcare exclude people? It's the same thing with climate. How do we build a relationship with the climate system in which we're not adding burdens to those who are already burdened by poverty? And so it's just, the real big question is there, how do you have an inclusive, fully inclusive and fair system of how you think of your community going forward? What's community well-being and what's your own well-being? I think Abigail is coming in to help us close things out. Hey, this has been great. What a great bunch of students. And let's see if there's might be one more online. Smiley Kylie face asks, that's pretty funny. Has the Paris Agreement encouraged any competitiveness for countries and or shame for those who cannot keep up? Can the social environment cause problems? That's a great question. I think, you know, these agreements are built on that. It's built on having a sense of community, transparency, sustained engagement, such that, you know, and one thing that's really important now that I think will drive the Paris Agreement forward with all of its limits is the role of technology, and having an observed planet can add an external pressure for change. Like right now, satellites are monitoring coal use in China or coal use anywhere in the world. We know you don't have to rely on a company or the country to tell you which power plants are operating or not operating. We know that via satellite remote sensing. So that growing transparency that can be imposed, and that goes for companies too. My favorite example, maybe this is a good place to end, is the Volkswagen scandal. And I'm sorry about the questions that have come in that we can't quite get to. When these Volkswagen diesel cars were shown to be cheating, that came out of a university in West Virginia with a tiny little grant. They revealed that misbehavior and that fraud by testing cars in a certain way. And that shows you again that there's incredible distributed capacity to impose transparency on entities that would prefer to be opaque and that can drive the world forward in a progressive way. So thank you for doing this. Would you like to, Kirsten and Abigail, can you have some final thoughts?
I just want to say thank you again for joining us to talk with us, because I think it gave us a lot to think about in comparing how these various interventions, political, economic, and activists impact climate justice, essentially. So it really gave us a lot to think about in that regard. And I really appreciate you making the time to speak with the students today. And I was really impressed by all of the questions and engagement from all of you all students, especially you all on the webcast that didn't know you were going to be part of the show. So
yeah, I'll just echo.
Kirsten, did you want to?
Well,
Kirsten?
I'll just echo Abigail. Thank you so much. Thanks to the students and your really sincere, genuine care about our planet and these times and justice. And thank you, Andrew, so much for being such a resource and a rich resource. It's just a great opportunity for us. And thank you, Abigail, for taking the lead and making this connection. So yeah, really feeling buoyed by this morning's talk. It's my morning.
That's great.
And I will say thank you, Twitter, for making the connection, because that's where I first was able to reach out to Andrew.
That's great. Well, I'm a big fan of Twitter. So I think it's part of what I was talking about before, not just transparency and that, from satellites and stuff, but our connectedness now is a source of sustainability. If the big if is, you have to want to do that. It's like, you have to want to connect, because the system will distract you to death. It'll aggravate you to death, meaning the flows of information around us, or it could connect us and create cohesion and continuity in ways that we can't do otherwise. So, you couldn't find me previously. A month ago, I was talking to a community in Bhopal, India, doing great work to get food to their lockdown forest, and I couldn't have connected with them, and their ideas were being shared around the world through this. So it's all a good system if we use it. So I'd like to just do one thing here. Close out with a little boilerplate, if I can find it here. I wouldn't be able to do this without some support from my people here at Columbia University. Oh, where is it? Hold on. Give me one more second. So sustain what? Sustain what is this? It's a global online conversation identifying solutions to the complicated, shape-shifting, and epic challenges of humanity's great acceleration. A prime focus is making sense of and getting the most out of the planet's fast-forward information environment. It's the one Earth system changing faster than the actual environment. This webcast is produced as part of my work building Columbia University's new Earth Institute initiative on communication and sustainability. For the time being, these sessions will be focused mostly on mitigating the unfolding societal and disruption and devastation driven by the global spread of COVID-19, this pandemic. But we're absolutely exploring other subjects and issues, as we did today, as the time allows. And I hope you'll all keep tuning in here. It's very easy to find. On Sunday, we're doing our weekly Sunday jam session. Essentially, it's mostly songs and poetry. Next Wednesday, we're having a big discussion of the politics framing around solving the coronavirus and climate problems with Peter Coleman, who runs this amazing thing here called the Difficult Conversations Laboratory. And I think on Monday, we're hoping to do a special session about a cyclone that's heading for Bangladesh, connecting reporters there with a climatologist at Columbia who knows a lot about the dynamics of the region there. So that's what I'm trying to do: connect, distribute, stimulate. Thank you all. Thanks the University of California system and UCSC particularly and these students who have the grandest challenge and opportunity ahead of them. This cohort right now, you're living in history, and that's hard, but it's also incredibly important to think about how to make a contribution going forward, to innovate, to build new capacities to allow you to have the resilience that we all need. So thank you all for tuning in. And
Thank
here we go.
you.